There's a particular kind of silence that follows you everywhere. Not the peaceful kind that comes with solitude, but the heavy kind that settles in your chest when you realize your phone hasn't buzzed with a genuine message in weeks. It's the silence of walking through crowded spaces and feeling completely invisible, of having thoughts you want to share but no one to share them with, of celebrating small victories alone and carrying disappointments in isolation. This is the reality for millions of people who find themselves without friends, not by choice, but by circumstance. You might assume these are antisocial individuals who prefer isolation, but that assumption misses something profound. The psychology behind having no friends is far more complex than simple preference or personality type. It's a web of past experiences, learned behaviors, and adaptive mechanisms that often trap people in cycles they desperately want to break. Understanding this psychology reveals something uncomfortable about human connection itself, how fragile it really is, how easily it can slip away, and how difficult it becomes to rebuild once it's gone. When researchers study social isolation, they discover something fascinating. The brain of someone without friends doesn't just miss companionship. It actually begins to change structurally. Neural pathways associated with social cognition start to weaken. The areas responsible for reading facial expressions and interpreting social cues become less active. It's as if the mind, deprived of social interaction, begins to forget how to connect. This isn't weakness or choice. It's neuroplasticity, adapting to an environment of isolation. But how does someone end up in this position in the first place? The path to friendlessness rarely happens overnight. It's usually a gradual erosion that begins with small betrayals or disappointments. Maybe it started in childhood with being excluded from playground games. Perhaps it was a trusted friend who shared secrets meant to stay private. Or a group that slowly drifted away without explanation, leaving someone wondering what they did wrong. Each of these experiences creates what psychologists call social learning. The brain begins to associate vulnerability with pain, trust with disappointment, and openness with rejection. So it develops protective mechanisms. It tells the person to hold back, to share less, to expect less from others. These aren't conscious decisions. They're automatic responses designed to prevent future hurt. Over time, these protective mechanisms become invisible barriers. The person starts interpreting neutral social interactions as signs of disinterest. They read too much into delayed text responses or cancelled plans. They assume others are merely being polite when showing kindness. This hypervigilance to social rejection creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they expect rejection, the more they behave in ways that actually push people away. There's another layer to this psychology that's often overlooked. People without friends frequently develop an intense inner dialogue. When external conversation disappears, internal conversation becomes louder. They replay past interactions endlessly, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning. They rehearse future conversations that may never happen. They create elaborate fantasies about friendships they wish they had. This internal world becomes both refuge and prison. It's a place where they can be completely themselves without fear of judgment, but it's also a place where thoughts can spiral without external reality checks. Without friends to challenge their perspectives or offer alternative viewpoints, their thinking can become increasingly rigid or distorted. The irony is that many people without friends possess exceptional emotional intelligence. They've spent so much time observing human behavior from the outside that they often understand social dynamics better than those actively participating in them. They can spot insincerity from across a room. They notice when someone's smile doesn't match their eyes. They pick up on subtle shifts in group energy that others completely miss. But this heightened awareness becomes a double-edged sword. When you can see through surface-level pleasantries and recognize performative friendships, it becomes harder to accept anything less than authentic connection. The problem is that authentic connection requires vulnerability from both sides, and vulnerability feels terrifying when you've been hurt before. So they wait. They wait for someone who feels safe enough to risk opening up to. Someone who demonstrates genuine interest rather than social obligation. Someone who can handle their depth without being overwhelmed or frightened away. But while they're waiting for this perfect connection, they often appear distant or uninterested to others, creating a barrier that prevents even potentially good friendships from forming. The psychology of isolation also affects how these individuals view themselves. Without the mirror of friendship to reflect their positive qualities back to them, they often develop a distorted self-image. They focus on their perceived flaws and minimize their strengths. They convince themselves they have nothing valuable to offer in relationships. This self-perception becomes a lens through which they interpret every social interaction. When someone does show interest in connecting with them, they often can't believe it's genuine. They assume the person must want something, or they're just being nice, or they'll eventually discover what's wrong with them and leave. This skepticism, while born from past pain, sabotages present opportunities. What makes this particularly tragic is that people without friends often crave connection more intensely than anyone else. They've experienced the absence of it so deeply that they understand its value in ways that others take for granted. They don't want casual acquaintances or surface-level socializing. They hunger for the kind of friendship where silence feels comfortable, where they can be completely themselves, where they're truly known and accepted. This craving for depth over breadth means they often reject opportunities for lighter social connections that could potentially develop into something more meaningful over time. They want to skip the small talk and dive straight into meaningful conversation. But most relationships need time to develop that level of trust and intimacy. The adaptation to friendlessness also changes how they experience time and memory. Without shared experiences to anchor their memories, time can feel both empty and heavy. They might struggle to remember what they did last weekend because nothing particularly meaningful happened. Or they might fixate on small interactions because they were the only human connection they had all week. Their relationship with solitude becomes complicated. On one hand, they've learned to be comfortable alone because they've had to be. They've developed rich inner lives, creative pursuits, and independent interests. But this comfort with solitude can also become a trap. The longer they spend alone, the more foreign social interaction feels. The more foreign it feels, the more anxious they become about engaging with others. And the more anxious they become, the more they retreat into solitude. Itude. The cycle deepens when they realize how much social skill they've lost through lack of practice. Conversation that once felt natural now requires conscious effort. They second-guess their responses, overthink their timing, and analyze every micro-expression for signs of boredom or discomfort. What used to be instinctive becomes mechanical, like trying to remember how to ride a bicycle after years of walking everywhere. This social rustiness creates a cruel irony. The very thing they need most, practice with human connection, becomes the thing they fear most because they feel unprepared for it. They know they're out of practice, which makes them more nervous, which makes them perform worse, which confirms their belief that they're not good at relationships. It's a feedback loop that keeps tightening with each failed attempt. There's also the matter of social context that people without friends must navigate. Society expects certain social behaviors. It expects you to have people to call when something exciting happens. It expects you to have someone to bring to weddings or parties. It expects you to have references for your character beyond professional contacts. When you don't have these things, you start to feel like you're failing at being human in some fundamental way. They develop elaborate strategies to hide their friendlessness. They decline invitations rather than admit they don't have anyone to bring as a plus one. They create excuses for why they can't join group activities. They learn to deflect conversations about weekend plans or social events. This constant performance of having a social life when you don't is exhausting and further isolates them from authentic connection. The digital age has added new layers to this psychology. Social media presents a constant stream of other people's friendships, celebrations, and connections. They scroll through photos of group dinners, weekend trips, and birthday parties, feeling like they're watching life happen to everyone except them. The comparison becomes unavoidable and painful. Everyone else seems to have figured out something they're missing. Yet paradoxically, online spaces can also provide a lifeline. Anonymous forums, virtual communities, and digital friendships offer a form of connection that feels safer. They can share thoughts and experiences without the vulnerability of face-to-face interaction. They can disconnect if things become uncomfortable. But these digital connections, while valuable, often highlight what they're missing in physical reality. The absence of friends also changes their relationship with their own emotions. Without someone to process experiences with, feelings can become overwhelming or confusing. Joy feels hollow when there's no one to share it with. Sadness feels infinite when there's no one to comfort them. Anger has nowhere to go except inward. They become their own emotional processing system, which works to a point, but human emotions were designed to be shared and reflected back through relationship. This emotional isolation can lead to a kind of emotional hoarding. They save up stories, experiences, and thoughts, hoping someday they'll have someone to share them with. But by the time that someone arrives, if they ever do, the stories feel stale and the emotions have lost their immediacy. They realize they can't dump years of accumulated experiences on a new person without overwhelming them. The psychology of friendlessness also involves a complex relationship with hope. Some days they feel optimistic that things will change, that they'll meet someone who understands them, that they'll find their tribe. Other days, they feel resigned to a life of solitude, convincing themselves it's easier this way. This oscillation between hope and resignation becomes its own form of emotional exhaustion. They often develop a heightened sensitivity to rejection, real or perceived. A delayed response to a text becomes evidence of disinterest. A cancelled plan becomes proof that they're not worth someone's time. A group conversation that moves on without their input becomes confirmation that they don't belong. These interpretations aren't always accurate, but when you're already feeling vulnerable, your brain tends to confirm your worst fears rather than challenge them. What's particularly poignant is how this affects their capacity for self-advocacy. People without friends often become excellent at meeting everyone else's needs while neglecting their own. They're so grateful for any social interaction that they accept treatment they wouldn't normally tolerate. They become overly accommodating, agreeable, and flexible, hoping that being easy to be around will make people want to keep them around. But this people-pleasing strategy often backfires because it prevents authentic relationship from forming. When you're constantly adapting yourself to what you think others want, you never give them a chance to know or appreciate who you really are. You become a reflection of their preferences rather than a distinct individual worthy of friendship. The fear of being too much becomes overwhelming. They monitor themselves constantly for signs that they're sharing too much, caring too much, or needing too much. This self-surveillance creates an artificial distance, even when they're physically with others. They're so busy managing their own behavior that they can't be present in the interaction. Time takes on a different quality when you have no friends. Weekends stretch endlessly without plans or social anchors. Holidays become reminders of what's missing rather than celebrations to enjoy. Birthdays pass quietly, sometimes without anyone noticing. The rhythm of life that others take for granted, the natural ebb and flow of social connection, simply doesn't exist. Yet within this seemingly barren landscape, something remarkable often emerges. The absence of external validation forces a confrontation with the self that most people never experience. Without friends to reflect back who they are, they must discover their own identity through internal exploration. This can lead to profound self-knowledge, creativity, and independence that others might never develop. They become connoisseurs of their own company. They learn what truly interests them versus what they thought they should be interested in to fit in with others. They develop hobbies and passions that are genuinely their own, not influenced by group dynamics or peer pressure. In many ways, they know themselves better than people surrounded by friends ever could. This deep self-awareness creates an interesting paradox. While they struggle with social connection, they often possess remarkable insight into human nature. Having observed relationships from the outside for so long, they understand the mechanics of friendship in ways that participants might miss. They can see the unspoken hierarchies, the subtle manipulations, the performative aspects of social interaction that others remain blind to. But this clarity can become another barrier. Once you see how much of social interaction is theatre, it becomes difficult to participate authentically. You start questioning whether people actually like you or just enjoy having an audience. You wonder if the laughter is genuine or obligatory. You analyze every gesture for signs of pretense, making it nearly impossible to relax into natural connection. The anticipation of social situations becomes its own form of torture. They spend days preparing for a simple coffee meetup, rehearsing conversations, and predicting every possible direction the interaction might take. By the time the actual meeting arrives, they're emotionally exhausted from the mental preparation. The spontaneity that makes relationships enjoyable has been replaced by calculated performance. Their internal critic becomes louder in the absence of external voices. Without friends to challenge negative self-talk or provide alternative perspectives, they can become trapped in cycles of self-doubt and harsh self-judgment. The voice in their head grows more authoritative because it's the only voice they hear consistently. It becomes judge, jury, and prosecutor of every social misstep. Sleep patterns often change when you live without friends. The quiet evening hours that others fill with phone calls, text conversations, or social plans stretch endlessly. The mind, deprived of external stimulation, turns inward, often at the worst possible moments. Bedtime becomes a confrontation with loneliness rather than a peaceful transition to rest. They develop an acute sensitivity to the social rhythms around them. They notice when co-workers make lunch plans without including them. They observe how naturally others form groups and alliances. They become anthropologists of human connection, studying behavior patterns they can't quite replicate themselves. This observational skill is both gift and curse, providing insight while highlighting their exclusion. The concept of home changes when you have no friends. Home becomes the only place where they can truly relax their social vigilance. But it can also become a refuge that's too comfortable to leave. The outside world starts feeling increasingly foreign and threatening. Home becomes both sanctuary and prison, offering safety at the cost of growth. Their relationship with technology reflects this isolation in complex ways. They might scroll endlessly through social media, seeking connection through observation of others' lives. Or they might avoid it entirely, unable to bear the constant reminder of what they lack. Technology offers the illusion of connection, while often deepening the sense of isolation. Understanding the psychology of people without friends reveals something profound about the human condition itself. That connection isn't just nice to have, it's essential to who we are. But perhaps most importantly, it shows us that isolation isn't a character flaw or personal failing. It's often the result of protective mechanisms that once served a purpose, but now stand in the way of the very thing the heart craves most. For those walking this path, remember that your depth, your sensitivity, your hard-won self-knowledge aren't obstacles to friendship. They're exactly what makes you worth knowing.